Hello everyone and welcome back to Bunniichii Corner. It seems we are drawing ever nearer to All Hallows Eve. As such, I think we should continue with the tradition of telling some ghost stories by a fire, don't you? This week I want to share with you The Scar, written by Ramsey Campbell. An interesting bit of insight into what things might go on behind closed doors, and truly showing you that you don't know everyone that you think. Please enjoy. It was most odd on the bus today, Lindsay Rice said. Jack Rossiter threw his cigarette into the fire and lit another. His wife Harriet glanced at him uneasily. She could see he was in no mood for her brother's accommodations. Most odd, said Lindsay. Rather upsetting, in fact. It reminded me of the Germans. Now, was it Germans? Yeah. Yes, I think it was the Germans used to have this thing about doppelgangers. The idea being that if you saw your double, it meant you were going to die. But of course you didn't see him. That's right, of course. I should explain. Jack moved in his armchair. I'm sorry, Lindsay, he interrupted. I just don't see where you're tending. I'm sorry. It's all right, Lindsay, Harriet said. Jack's been a bit tired lately. Go on. But at that moment, the children tumbled into the room like pirouettes, their striped pajamas bowled against the pastel lines of wallpaper. Douglas tried to throw me into the bath, and he hasn't brushed his teeth, Elaine shouted triumphantly. There'll be spankings for two in a minute, Jack threatened, but he smiled. Good night, darling. Good night, darling. No, you've had a hard day, darling. I'll put them to bed. Not so hard as you, Harriet said, standing up. You stay and talk to Lindsay. Jack grimaced inwardly. He had wanted Harriet to rest, but somehow it now appeared as if he'd been trying to escape Lindsay. Sorry, Lindsay, you were saying? He prompted as the thumping on the staircase ceased. Oh, yes, on the bus. Well, it was this morning. I saw someone who looked like you. I was going to speak to him until I realized... Rice glanced around the room. Although his weekly invitation was of some years' standing, he could never remember exactly where everything was. Not that it mattered. The whole was solid. Armchairs, television, bookcase full of penguins and book club editions and Sheriff's Valuer's Manual. There it was, on top of the bookcase. The wedding photograph which Jack had carefully framed for Harriet. Yes, he was as thin as you've been getting, but he had a scar from here to here. Rice encompassed his left temple and jawbone with finger and thumb like dividers. So he really wasn't my double. My time hasn't run out after all. Well, I hope not, Rice laughed a little too long. Jack felt his mouth stretching as he forced it to be sociable. How are things at the jeweler's? Nothing stolen yet, I hope? No, everything's under control, Jack replied. Feet ran across the floor above. Hang on, Lindsay, he said. Sounds like Harriet's having trouble. Harriet had quelled the rebellion when he arrived. She closed the door of the children's room and regarded him. Christ, the man's tact, he exploded. Shh, Jack, he'll hear you. She put her arms around him. Don't be cruel to Lindsay, she pleaded. You know I always had the best of everything, and Lindsay never did. Unhappy at school, always being put down by my father, never daring to open his mouth. Darling, you know he finds it difficult to talk to people. Now I've got you. Surely we can spare him kindness at least. Of course we can. He stroked her hair. It's just that... Damn it, not only does he say I'm losing weight as though I'm being underfed or something, but he asks me if the shop's been broken into yet. Poor darling, don't worry. I'm sure the police will catch them before they raid the shop, and if not, there's always insurance. Yes, there's insurance, but it won't rebuild my display. Can't you understand I take as much pride in my shop as you take in the house? Probably some jumped-up little skinheads who throw the loot away once their tardy little teeny boppers have played with it. That doesn't sound like you at all, Jack, Harriet said. I'm sorry, love. You know I'm really here. Come on. I'd better fix up tomorrow night with Lindsay. If you feel like a rest, we could have him round here. No, he opens out a bit when he's in a pub. Besides, I like the walk to Lower Brookshire. Just so long as you come back in one piece, my love. Rice heard them on the stairs. He hurried back to his chair from the bookcase where he had been inspecting the titles. One of these days he must offer to lend them some books, anything to make them like him more. He knew he'd driven Jack upstairs. Why couldn't he be direct instead of circling the point like a wobbling whirligig? But every time he tried to grasp an intention or a statement, it slid out of his reach. Even if he hung a sign on his bedroom wall, he'd once thought of one actually. I shall act directly. He would forget it before he left the flat, even as he forgot his musings when Jack and Harriet entered the room. I'd be better off, he said. You can never tell with the last bus round here. I'll see you tomorrow night then, Jack told him, patting his shoulder. I'll call round and pick you up. But he never had the courage to invite them to his flat, Lindsay thought. He knew it wasn't good enough for them. Not that they would show it. Rather, they would do everything to hide their feelings out of kindness, which would be worse. Tomorrow night, as usual, he would be downstairs early to wait for Jack in the doorway. He waved to them as they stood linked in their bright frame, then struck off down the empty road. The fields were gray and silent, and above the semi-detached roofs the moon was set in a plush ring of cold November mist. At the bus stop, he thought, I wish I could do something for them, so they'd be grateful to me. Harriet was bending over the cooker. She heard no footsteps. She had no chance to turn before the newspaper was over her face. I see the old Jack's back with us, she said, fighting off the Brickster Herald. You haven't seen it? He guided her hand to the headline. Youths arrested. Admit to jewel thefts. He was beaming. He read the report again with Harriet, the 3 boys who'd hoped to stockpile jewelry but had been unable to market it without attracting the police. Maybe now we can all get some sleep, he said. Maybe I can give up smoking. Don't give it up for me, Jack. I know you need it. But if you did give it up, I'd be very happy. Douglas and Elaine appeared, pummeling towards their tea. Now just you sit down and wait, Jack said, or we'll eat it for you. After tea, he lit a cigarette, then glanced at Harriet. Don't worry, darling, she advised. Take things easy for a while. Come on, monsters, you can help clean up. She knew the signs. Spilled sugar, dropped knife. Jack would turn hypertense with a relief if he didn't rest. But 10 minutes later, he was in the kitchen. Must go, he said. Give myself time for a stroll before I meet Lindsay. Anyways, the news ought to give the conversation a lift. Come back whole, darling, Harriet said, not knowing. Yes, he liked to walk through Lower Brichester. He'd made the walk, with variations, for almost 2 years, ever since his night out drinking with Rice had settled into habit. It had been his suggestion primarily to please Harriet, for he knew she liked to think that he and Lindsay were friends, but by now he met Lindsay out of a sense of duty, which was rarely proof against annoyance as the evening wore on. Never mind, there was the walk. If he felt insecure, as he often did when walking, the night, Harriet elsewhere, he gained a paradoxical sense of security from Lower Brichester. The bleared fish and chip shop windows, the crowds outside pubs, a drunk punching someone's face with a soft, moist sound. It reassured him to think that there was a level to which he could never be reduced. Headlights blazed down a side street, billowing with mist and motorcycle fumes. They spotlighted a broken wall across the street from Rossiter. A group of girls huddled on the shattered bricks, laughing forth fog as the motorcycle gang fondled them roughly with words. Rossiter gazed at them. No doubt the jewel thieves had been of the same mold. He felt a little guilty as he watched the girls, embracing themselves to keep out the cold, but he had his answer ready. Nothing would change them. They were fixed. If he had money, it was because he could use it properly. He turned onward. He would have to use the alley on the right if he were not to keep Rice waiting. Suddenly, the shrieks of laughter behind the roaring engines were cut off. A headlight was feeling its way along the walls, finding one house protruding part of a ruined frontage like a piece of jigsaw. The next, dismally curtained, its neighbor shuttered with corrugated tin, its makeshift door torn down like an infuriating lid. For a moment, the beam followed a figure, a man in a long black coat swaying along the pavement. a gray woolen sock pulled down over his face. The girls huddled closer, silently. Jack shuddered. The exploratory progress of the figure seemed unformed, undirected. Then the light was gone. The girls giggled in the darkness, and beyond a street lamp the figure fumbled into the tin-shuttered house. Jack turned up his coat collar and hurried into the alley. The engines roared louder. He was halfway up the alley when he heard the footsteps. The walls were narrow. There was barely room for the other, who seemed in a hurry to pass. Jack pressed against the wall. It was cold and rough beneath his hand. Behind him, the footsteps stopped. He looked back. The entrance to the alley whirled with fumes, against which a figure moved towards him, vaguely outlined. It held something in its hand. Jack felt automatically for his lighter. Then the figure spoke. "You're Jack Rossiter." The voice was soft and anonymous, yet somehow penetrated the crescendo of the motorcycles. "I'll be visiting your shop soon." For a moment, Jack thought he must know the man, though his face was merely a black egg in the shadows, but something in the figure's slow approach warned him. Suddenly, he knew what that remark implied. Cold rushed into his stomach, and metal glinted in the figure's hand. Jack retreated along the wall, his fingers searching frantically for a door. His foot tangled within an abandoned tin. He kicked it towards the figure and ran. The fog boiled around him. Metal clattered. A foot hooked his ankle and tripped him. The engines were screaming. As Jack raised his head, a car was being thrust into his eyes. He scrabbled at potato peelings and sardine tins and struggled to his knees. A foot between his shoulders ground him down. The car's light dimmed and vanished. He struggled onto his back, cold peel sticking to his cheek, and the foot pressed on his heart. The metal closed in the figure's palm. Above him, hands displayed the tin which he had kicked. The insidious voice said something. When the words reached him, Rossiter began to tear at the leg in horror and fury. The black egg bent nearer. The foot pressed harder, and the rusty lid of the tin came down towards Jack's face. Though the bandage was off, he could still feel the cut, blazing now and then from his temple to his jawbone. He forced himself to forget. He stuffed fuel into the living room fire and opened his book. Though the bandage was off, he could still feel the cut, blazing now and then from his temple to his jawbone. He forced himself to forget. He stuffed fuel into the living room fire and opened his book. But it failed to soothe him. "Don't brood," he told himself savagely. "Worse is probably happening in Lower Bridgester at this moment. If only Harriet hadn't seen him unbandaged at the hospital." He could feel her pain more keenly than his own since he'd come home. He kept thinking of her letting the kettle scream so that he wouldn't hear her sobbing in the kitchen. Then she'd brought him coffee, her face still wet beneath her hair from water to wash away the tears. Why had he told her at the hospital? "It's not what he did to me, it's what he said he'd do to Douglas and Elaine." He cursed himself for spreading more suffering than he himself had had to stand. Even Rice had seemed to feel himself obscurely to blame, although Jack had insisted that it was his own fault for walking through that area. "Go and say goodnight to Daddy," Harriet called. The children patted in. "Daddy's face is getting better," Elaine said. He saw the black egg bearing down on them. God, he swore if he should lay one finger. "Daddy's surviving his accident," he told them. "Good night, children." Presently, he heard Harriet slowly descending the stairs, each step a thought. Suddenly, she rushed into the room and hid her face on his chest. "Oh, please, please, darling, what did he say about the children?" she cried. "I won't have you disturbed, my love," he said, holding her as she trembled. "I can worry enough for both of us, and as long as you take them here and back to school, it doesn't matter what the sod said." "And what about your shop?" she asked through her tears. "Never mind the shop." He tried not to think of his dream of the smashed window, of the foul disorder he might find one morning. "The police will find him. Don't worry." "But you couldn't even describe—" The doorbell rang. Oh, God, it's Lindsay, she said. Could you go, darling? I can't let him see me like this. Oh, that's good. I mean, I'm glad you've got the bandage off, said Lindsay. Behind him, the fog swallowed the bedraggled trees and blotted out the fields. He stared at Jack, then muttered, Sorry, better let you close the door. Come in and get some fire, Jack said. Harriet will have the coffee ready in a minute. Bryce plodded round the room, then sat down opposite Jack. He stared at the wedding photograph. He rubbed his hands and gazed at them. He looked up at the ceiling. At last, he turned to Jack. What? He glanced around wildly. What's that you're reading? The Heart of the Matter. Second time, in fact. You should try it sometime. Harriet looked in, dabbing at one eye. Hello, Lindsay. If we're talking about books, Jack, you said you'd read The Lord of the Rings. Well, I can't now, darling, since I'm working tomorrow. Back to work at last, Lindsay. Heaven knows what sort of state the shop will be in with Phillips in charge. You always said you could rely on him in an emergency, Harriet protested. Well, this is the test. Yes, white as usual for me, please, darling. Harriet withdrew to the kitchen. I read a book this week, Rice caught at the conversation, about a man. What's his name? No, I forget. Whose friend is in a danger from someone. He finds out and he finally pulls this someone off a cliff and gets killed himself. He was about to add, at least he did something with himself. I don't like books about people failing. But Jack took the cue. A little unrealistic for me, he said, after what happened. Oh, I never asked. Rice's hands gripped each other. Where did it? Just off the street parallel to yours. The next but two, in the alley. But that's where he lost something again. Where there's all sorts of violence. You shouldn't live so near it, Lindsay, Harriet said above a tray. Make the effort. Move soon. Depressing night, Jack remarked as he helped Rice don his coat. Drop that book in sometime, Lindsay. I'd like to read it. Of course he wouldn't, Rice thought as he breathed in the curling fog and met the trees forming from the murk. He'd been trying to be kind. Rice had failed again. Why had he been unable to speak? To tell Jack that he had seen his double leave the bus and enter an abandoned house opposite that alley. The night of the mutilation, Rice had waited in his doorway, feeling forsaken, sure that Jack had decided not to come. Ashamed now, he blamed himself. Jack would be whole now if Rice hadn't made him feel it was his duty to meet him. Something was going to happen. He sensed it looming. If he could only warn them, prevent it. But prevent what? He saw the figures falling from the cliff top against the azure sky, the seagulls screaming around him. But the mist hung about him miserably, stifling his intentions. He began to hurry to the bus stop. The week unfolded warily. It was as formless in Rice's mind as the obscured fields when he walked up the Rossiter Street again, his book collecting droplets in his hand. He rang the bell and waited, shivering. The windows were blurred by mist. Oh, Lindsay, said Harriet. She had run to the door. It was clear she had been crying. I don't know whether... Jack appeared in the hall, one hand possessively gripping the living room doorframe, the cigarette upon his lip flaking down his shirt. Is it your night already? He demanded of Rice. I thought it'd be early to bed for us. Come in, for God's sake, don't freeze us to death. Harriet threw Lindsay a pleading look which he could not interpret. Sorry, he said. I didn't know you were tired. Who said tired? Come on, man, start thinking. God, I give up. Jack threw up his hands and whirled into the living room. Lindsay, Jack's been having a terrible time. The shop was broken into last night. What's all that whispering? A voice shouted. Aren't I one of the family anymore? Jack, don't be illogical. Surely Lindsay and I can talk. But she motioned Lindsay into the living room. "Treating me like a stranger in my own house!" Lindsay dropped the book. Suddenly he realized what he'd seen. Jack's face was pale, thinner than last week. The scar looked older than seemed possible. He bent for the book. No, what he was thinking was absurd. Harriet would have noticed. Jack was simply worried. It must be worry. "Brought me a book, have you? Let's see it then. Oh, for God's sake, Lindsay, I can't waste my time with this sort of thing." "Jack!" cried Harriet. "Lindsay brought it specially." "Don't pity Lindsay. He won't thank you for it. You think we're patronizing you, don't you, Lindsay? Inviting you up to the posh end of town?" This couldn't be, Rice thought. Not in this pastel living room, not with a wedding photograph fixed forever. Their lives were solid, not ephemeral like his own. I don't know what you mean," he faltered. "Jack, I won't have you speaking to Lindsay like that," Harriet said. "Lindsay, would you help me make the coffee?" "Siding with your brother now?" Jack accused. "I don't need him at a time like this. I need you. You've forgotten to shop already, but I haven't. I suppose I needn't expect any comfort tonight." "Oh, Jack, try and get a grip on yourself." But now her voice was softer. "Don't," Lindsay warned her frantically. "That's exactly what he wants." "Take your book, Lindsay," Jack said through his fingers, "and make sure you're invited in future." Harriet glanced at him in anguish and hurried Lindsay out. "I'm sorry you've been hurt, Lindsay," she said. "Of course you're always welcome here. You know we love you. Jack didn't mean it. I know something would happen when I heard about the shop. Jack just ran out of it and didn't come back for hours, but he didn't know it would be like this." Her voice broke. "Maybe you better not come again until Jack's more stable. I'll tell you when it's over. You do understand, don't you?" "Of course. It doesn't matter," Lindsay said, trembling with formless thoughts. On the hall table, a newspaper had been crumpled furiously. He saw the headline, "Jewelers raided. Displays destroyed." "Can I have the paper?" he asked. "Take it, please. I'll get in touch with you. I promise. Don't lose heart." As the door closed, Rice heard Jack call, "Harriet!" in what sounded like despair. Above, the children were silhouetted on the bedroom window. As Rice trudged away, the fog engulfed them. At the bus stop, he read the report. A window broken, destruction everywhere. He gazed ahead blindly. Shafts of bilious yellow pierced the fog, then the gray returned. Start thinking, was it? Oh, yes. He could think. Think how easy it would be to fake a raid, knowing the insurance would rebuild what had been destroyed. But he didn't want the implications. The idea was insane anyway. Who would destroy simply in order to have an excuse for appearing emaciated, unstable? But his thoughts returned to Harriet. He avoided thinking what might be happening in that house. "You're jealous," he tried to tell himself. "He's her husband. He has the right." Rice became aware that he was holding the book which he had brought for Jack. He stared at the tangled figures falling through blue drops of condensation, then thrust the book into the litter bin between empty tins and a sherry bottle. He stood, waiting, in the fog. The fog trickled through Rice's kitchen window. He leaned his weight on the sash, but again it refused to shut. He shrugged helplessly and tipped the beans into the saucepan. The tap dripped once. He gripped it and screwed it down. Below the window, someone came out coughing and shattered something in the dustbin. The tap dripped. He moved towards it and the bell rang. It was Harriet in a headscarf. "Oh, don't come in," he said. "It's not fit, I mean." "Don't be silly, Lindsay," she told him edgily. "Let me in." Her eyes gathered details. The twig-like crack in one corner of the ceiling, the alarm clock whose hand had been amputated, the cobweb supporting the lamp flex from the ceiling like a bracket. But this is so depressing," she said. "Don't stay here, Lindsay. You must move." "It's just the bed's not made," he tried to explain, but he could see her despairing. He had to turn the subject. "Jack all right?" he asked, then remembered. But too late. She pulled off her headscarf. "Lindsay, He hasn't been himself since they wrecked the shop, she said with determined calm. Rows all the time, breaking things. He broke our photograph. He goes out and gets drunk half the evenings. I've never seen him so irrational. Her voice faded. And there are other things that I can't tell you about. That's awful. That's terrible. He couldn't bear to see Harriet like this. She was the only one he had ever loved. Couldn't you get him to go see someone? I mean, we've already had a row about that. That was when he broke our photograph. How about the children? How's he been to them? Instantly, two pieces fitted together. He waited, chill with horror, for her answer. He tells them off for playing, but I can protect them. How could she be so blind? Suppose he should do something to them, he said. You'll have to get out. That's one thing I won't do. He's my husband, Lindsay. It's up to me to look after him. She can't believe that, Lindsay cried. He tottered on the edge of revelation and fought with his tongue. Don't you think he's acting as if he was a different person? He could not be more explicit. After what happens, that's not so surprising. She drew her headscarf through her fingers and pulled it back. Drew and pulled, drew and pulled. Lindsay looked away. He's left all the displays in Philip's hands. He's breaking down, Lindsay. I've got to nurse him back. He'll survive. I know he will. Survive? Lindsay thought with bitterness and horror. And suddenly he remembered that Harriet had been upstairs when he described his encounter on the bus. She would never realize, and his tongue would never allow him to tell her. Behind her compassion, he sensed a terrible devotion to Jack which he could not break. She was as trapped as he was in this flat. Yet if he could not speak, he must act. The plan against him was clear. He had been banished from the Rossiters' home. He was unable to protest, and Harriet would be alone. There was only one false assumption in the plan, and it concerned himself. It must be false. He could help. He gazed at Harriet. She would never understand, but perhaps she needn't suspect. The beans sputtered and smoldered in the pan. Oh, Lindsay, I'm awfully sorry, Harriet said. You must have your tea. I've got to get back before he comes home. I only called to tell you not to come round for a while. Please don't. I'll be all right. I'll stay away until you tell me, Lindsay lied. As she reached the hall, he called out. He felt bound to make what would happen as easy as he could for her. If anything should happen, he fumbled. You know, while Jack's disturbed, I could always help to look after the children. Rice could hear the children screaming from the end of the street. He began to walk towards the cries. He hadn't meant to go near the house. If his plan was to succeed, Harriet must not see him. Harriet, why wasn't she protecting the children? It couldn't be the Rossiters' house, he argued desperately. Sounds like that couldn't reach the length of the street. But the cries continued, piercing with terror and pain. They dragged his footsteps nearer. He reached the house and could no longer doubt. The bedrooms were curtained. The house was impossibly impassive, reflecting no part of the horror within. The fog clung grayly to the grass like scum on reeds. He could hear Elaine sobbing and then some screaming. Rice wanted to break in, to stop the sounds, to discover what was holding Harriet back, but if he went in, his plan would be destroyed. His palms prickled. He wavered miserably, and the silver pavement slithered beneath him. The front door of the next house opened, and a man, portly, red-faced, bespectacled, gray hair, black overcoat, valise clenched in his hand like a weapon, strode down the path, grinning at the screams. He passed Rice and turned at his aghast expression. What's the matter, friend? He asked with amusement in his voice. Never have your behind tanned when you were a kid? But listen to them, Rice said unevenly. They're screaming. And I should damn well think so, too, the other retorted. You know Jack Rossiter? Decent chap. About as much of a sadist as I am, and his kids ran in just now when we were having breakfast with some nonsense about their father doing something dreadful to them. I grabbed them by the scruff of their necks and dragged them back. One thing wrong with Rossiter. He was too soft with those kids, and now I'm glad he seems to have learned some sense. Listen, you know who taught kids to tell tales on their parents? The bloody Nazis, that's who. There'll be no kids turning into bloody Nazis in this country if I can help it. He moved away, glancing back at Rice as if suspicious of him. The cries had faded. Perhaps a door had closed. Stunned, Rice realized that he had been seen near the house. His plan was in danger. Well, I mustn't waste any more time, he called, trying to sound casual, and hurried after the man. I've got to catch my bus. At the bus stop, next to the man who was scanning the headlines and swearing, Rice watched the street for the figure he awaited, shivering with cold and indecision, his nostrils smarting with a faint stench of wet smoke. A bus arrived, his companion boarded. Rice stamped his feet and stared into the distance as if awaiting another. An inner critic told him he was overacting. When the bus had darkened and merged with fog, he retraced his steps. At the corner of the street, he saw the fog solidify into a striding shape. The mist pulled back like web from the scarred face. "Oh, Jack, can you spare a few minutes?" he said. "Why, it's the prodigal brother-in-law," came in a mist steaming from the mouth beside the scar. "I thought Harriet had warned you off. I'm in a hurry." Again, Rice was caught by a compulsion to rush into the house to discover what had happened to Harriet. But there were the children to protect. He must make sure they would never scream again. I thought I saw you. I did see you in Lower Bridgester a few weeks ago," he said, feeling the fog obscuring security. "You were going into a ruined house." "Who, me? It must have been my—" But the voice stopped. Breath hung before his face. Rice let his hatred drive out the words. "Your double? But then where did he go? Come on, I'll show you the house." For a moment, Rice doubted. Perhaps the figure would laugh and stride into the mist. Ice sliced through his toes. He tottered and then plunged. "How did you make sure there was nobody about?" he forced through swollen lips. "When you got rid of him?" The eyes flickered. The scar shifted. "Who, Phillips? God, man, I never did know what you meant half the time. He'll be wondering where I am. I'll have to think up a story to satisfy him." "I think you'll be able to do that." Cold with fear as he was, Rice was still warmed by fulfillment as he sensed that he had the upper hand, that he was able to taunt as he had the man on the cliff top before the plunge. He plunged into the fog, knowing that now he would be followed. The gray fields were abruptly blocked by a more solid anonymity, the streets of Lower Bridgester suffocating individuality, erasing it through generations. Whenever he'd walked through these streets with Jack on the short route to the pub, each glance of Jack's had reminded him that he was a part of this anonymity, this inertia. But no longer, he told himself. Signs of life were sparse. A postman cycled creaking by. Beyond a window, a radio announcer laughed. A cat curled among milk bottles. The door was rolled down on a pinball arcade, and a girl in a cheap fur coat was leaping about in the doorway of a boutique to keep herself warm until the keys arrived. Rice felt eyes finger the girl, then revert to him. They had watched him since the beginning of their journey, although the figure seemed to face always forward. Rice glanced at the other. He was gazing in the direction of his stride, and a block of ice grew in Rice's stomach while the glazing of the pavement cracked beneath his feet. They passed a square foundation enshrining a rusty pram. Here a bomb had blown a house asunder. The next street, Rice realized, and dug his nails into the rubber of the torch in his pocket. Blitz had almost bypassed Bridgester. Here and there one passed from curtained windows to a gaping house, eventually rebuilt if in the town, neglected in Lower Bridgester. Was this the key? Had someone been driven underground by Blitz conditions, or Had something been released by the bombing? In either case, what form of camouflage would they have had to adopt to live? Rice thought he knew, but he didn't want to think it through. He wanted to put an end to it. And round a corner, the abandoned house focused into view. A car purred somewhere. The pavement was faintly numbered for hopscotch. Rice gazed about covertly. There must be nobody in sight. And at his side, the figure did the same. Terrified, Rice yet had to repress a nervous giggle. "There's the house," he said. "I suppose you'll want to go in." "If you've got something to show me." The scar wrinkled again. Bricks were heaped in what had been the garden. Ice glistened in their pores. Rice could see nothing through the windows, which were shuttered with tin. A gray corrugated sheet had been peeled back from the doorway. It scraped at Rice's ankle as he entered. The light was dim. He gripped his torch. Above him, a shattered skylight illuminated a staircase full of holes through which moist dust fell. To his right, a door, one panel gouged out, still hung from a hinge. He hurried into the room, kicking a stray brick. The fireplace gaped, half curtained by a hanging strip of wallpaper. Otherwise, the room was bare, deserted probably for years. Of course, the people of the neighborhood didn't have to know exactly what was here to avoid it. In the hall, tin rasped. Rice ran into the kitchen, ahead on the left. Fog had penetrated a broken window. It filled his mouth as he panted. Opposite the cloven sink, he saw a door. He wrenched it open, and in the other room the brick clattered. Rice's hands were gloved in frozen iron. His nails were shards of ice thrust into the fingertips, melting into his blood. One hand clutched towards the back door. He tottered forward and heard the children scream, thought once of Harriet, saw the figures on the cliff. "I'm not a hero," he mouthed. "How in God's name did I get here?" And the answer came, because he'd never really believed what he'd suspected. But the torch was shining, and he swung it down in the steps beyond the open door. They led into a cellar. Bricks were scattered on the floor, bent knives and forks, soiled plates leading the torch beams to tattered blankets huddled against the walls, hints of others in the shadows. And in one corner lay a man, surrounded by tins and a strip of corrugated metal. The body glistened. Trembling, his mouth gaping at the stench which thickened the air, Rice descended and the torch's circle shrank. The man in corner was dressed in red. Rice moved nearer. With a shock, he realized that the man was naked, shining with red paint, which also marked the tins and strip of metal. Suddenly, he wrenched away and retched. For a moment, he was engulfed by nausea. Then he heard the footsteps in the kitchen. His fingers burned like wax and blushed at the clumsiness, but he caught up a brick. "You found what you expected, have you?" the voice called. Rice reached the steps, and a figure loomed above him, blotting out the light. With studied calm, it felt about in the kitchen and produced a strip of corrugated tin. "Fancy," it said. "I thought I'd have to bring you here to see Harriet. Now it'll have to be the other way around." Rice had no time to think. Focusing his horror, fear, and disgust with his lifetime of inaction, he threw the brick. Rice was shaking by the time he had finished. He picked up the torch from the bottom step and, as if compelled, turned its beam on the two corpses. Yes, they were of the same stature. They would have been identical, except that the face of the first was an abstract crimson oval. Rice shuddered away from his fascination. He must see Harriet. It didn't matter what excuse he gave, illness or anything, so long as he saw her. He shone the beam towards the steps to light his way, and the torch was wrested from his hand. He didn't think. He threw himself up the steps and into the kitchen. The bolts and lock on the back door had been rusted shut for years. Footsteps padded up the steps. He fell into the other room. Outside, an ambulance howled its way to hospital. Almost tripping on the brick, he reached the hall. The ambulance's blue light flashed in the doorway and passed, and a figure with a gray sock covering his face blocked the doorway. Rice backed away. No, he thought in despair. He couldn't fail now. The fall from the cliff had ended the menace, but already he knew. He backed into something soft, and a hand closed over his mouth. The figure plodded towards him, the gray wool sucked in and out. The figure was his height, his build. He heard himself saying, "I can always help to look after the children." And as the figure grasped a brick, he knew what face waited beneath the wool. Thank you for once again coming to this fireplace in a burrow. I hope that you, dear listener, have been enjoying these spooky stories that we tell while the flames crackle. I fear my time for storytelling is almost coming to an end. For you see, next week is Hallows Eve, a very special night indeed. Next week, I think I'll tell you a story that I believe we all know, backwards, forwards, and any which way. So until then, watch out for any doppelgangers that might follow you in the fog.